I tweeted out the other day that, if you loved Bitcoin, not crypto, as a meme and a message, you're going to love even more the Bitcoin, not ETF message. And what Preston was getting at is this is a top of the funnel thing, right? This is bringing people into Bitcoin. It's going to educate people about Bitcoin. Our job as a Bitcoin industry is then to further educate them to give up the ETF and buy and hold their own Bitcoin. And that is going to be a big project for us. So this idea of Bitcoin, not ETF, over the next few years, how important is it for us to successfully transmit that message to enough people such that Bitcoin will continue to stay resistant to centralization and avoid the fate of gold? Sam, let's go over to you for this one.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of there's a cohort of Bitcoiners kind of fighting against this ETF, but to me, it was always inevitable that Wall Street would realize the potential of Bitcoin and try to profit off of it with its financialization and trying to securitize it. And so really it's up to us as a community to build tools that make it easier for people to self-custody and enhance the decentralization of the overall network. And so for me, I think that's what we should focus on as a community. But then when you look at, the ETF, I think it is going to be a top of funnel. Like people, when they have skin in the game, they actually own, exposure to the price of Bitcoin. They'll see their wealth go up and they'll start to learn about this thing. And I believe that when people do that, they will start to realize like, oh, I actually don't own real Bitcoin. And maybe it will be that top of funnel where people will start to learn about it. Then they'll take self-custody. That's usually the progression that happens. And I do believe that the ETF is a big deal, though, especially for institutional investors who are currently restricted from either investment mandates or regulatory requirements from owning spot Bitcoin. I think it's kind of a more big deal for those like bigger institutional investors. But if you're an individual investor where you're not restricted from owning spot Bitcoin, I just don't really see why you wouldn't take self-custody and own the real thing instead of the paper Bitcoin, the ETF. And so it's up to us, the community, to build tools as well as educate, continue to educate this new wave. There's going to be a huge new wave of new participants that come into Bitcoin that maybe haven't heard some of these things before. And so it's up to us as a community to educate them.
So Preston, what about the risk? I know I've heard a lot of Bitcoiners express this concern. What about the risk of centralizing a bunch of Bitcoin? So ETFs become extremely popular, hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe even billions of dollars go into a Bitcoin ETF or Bitcoin ETFs. And all of that Bitcoin to back those shares is stored at Coinbase custody or some other, institutional grade custody service or provider. What's the risk that this leads to a 6102 situation against Bitcoin?
So the risk to me is zero. And the risk to anybody that's taking self-custody of their Bitcoin is zero.
Yeah.
But for people that are trusting these institutions, I mean, you're talking about a honeypot. And so I put out a tweet and I said, why is nobody talking about how every single not every single, there's Fidelity that's not, and I think BitGo or whatever is not as well. But for everybody else, they are using Coinbase as their custodian for all these Bitcoin that are going to be purchased on behalf of all these people that are owning the shares of these ETFs. I just, at the end of the day, the market's going to do what it does. Me just complaining about it, hopefully brings awareness and business opportunity for others to become custodians of these ETFs so that it's more spread out and there's not such a large honeypot. That's the only reason I tweeted it out and wanted to raise awareness. It's not that I'm anti-ETF or anti-this. I just think that there's way better ways that are less risky for individuals to take ownership of their money. And that's the point that I'm trying to make in the face of all of this. When you look at history and you look at when currencies change over, these types of things can get really nasty, where the government has to somehow figure out a way to fund itself. Obviously, these people running these governments don't want to cut spending by 50 to 80% because there's a new currency in town, and nobody knows the pace at which this is going to take place. Could this be 15, 20 years? Sure. Could it be 5 years? Sure. Do I know? You better believe I don't know. But what I do have is an appreciation for, if this happens quickly and things get what's the word I'm looking for? Disruptive or non-linear, the governments are going to have to do something to offset all of these expenditures that they have laid out. So what becomes an option at that point? Well, where's the biggest pot of Bitcoin that I can find so that I can take it and shove and make good for all the people that actually own those Bitcoin. I can shove a bunch of this freshly printed fiat into their hands to offset the fact that I'm stealing all this Bitcoin from them, which they'll be happy for 10 days. And all of a sudden they'll figure out what happened and they'll be furious because the price will be running that hard. That's what I'm worried about. I'm worried that these people that are, don't really even understand what it is that they own, but they're taking a small position, call it 1% or whatever, to own this, just as a portfolio construction kind of standpoint, aren't doing the hard work to actually understand the affinity stone that they're holding on to and the sheer power that it wields in the face of what is bound, in my opinion, bound to happen. So that is what is so important for people to wrap their head around. So let's say you have a family. This is how I would apply this. You're going to have a family member, a friend in the coming year that comes up to you and says, I bought 1% of my portfolio into the BlackRock ETF. And then you're going to nod your head and say, congratulations, that's awesome. You're up 100% this year, or whatever it might be, right? But the real conversation needs to move to, okay, so what are your risks in potentially owning that thing? And that's just it's a hard conversation. There's a tremendous amount of knowledge and understanding that has to go back behind all of that to even entertain that conversation with that person. And to be quite honest with you, I'm exhausted in having this conversation for this many years at this point. And I think that's where I'm getting frustrated in having to have the conversation yet again in another cycle, because you can see where the rug pull can potentially happen. And those are just some of my thoughts, but it doesn't, if you truly love these people and you want to help them, you need to somehow broach that subject if you think that they can potentially have the intellectual courage to go down that path. Most probably won't, but hopefully you can eventually get there at some point to highlight the risk.